Welcome back to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. For the second half of our show, we're pleased to speak with Lawson Bader, now in his second year as the president of the Competitive Enterprise Institute, our sponsor, where he focuses on promoting government transparency and the reduction of executive branch overreach. Lawson formerly served as vice president of the Mercatus Center at George Mason University and is a regular columnist at Human Events. Lawson, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Bill. Glad to be here.
Lawson, our prior guest, Louis Gov, posed a fascinating question, and I'd like to focus on that with you. And the question he asked was, there's three forms of liberty we find ourselves most concerned with: economic liberty, civil liberty, and political liberty. And as things are changing in Hong Kong, which is a place that has always had economic liberty and civil liberty, they're striving for political liberty, but there's concern that that might be a threat to economic liberty. Let me start by asking you, in Europe, hasn't that already happened?
I think it has. It is a question that political scientists and economists have been dealing with, is what's more important, economic liberty or civil liberty. And I think the conventional view portrays, conservatives as caring more about economic liberties than civil, and liberals, on the other hand, are conventionally viewed as, caring more about civil liberties than economic. And this, I think, manifests itself in Europe, which uses the word liberal democracy differently, of course, than we use liberal in the United States, as almost one and the same, that because we care about the working poor, and you have this sort of underlying socialist theme in Europe, that therefore we're going to use the power of the state to actually accomplish that.
We're going to use our political liberty to engage the state in things like redistribution.
Exactly. That's entirely what it is. And you certainly have differences between Germany, the United Kingdom, France, and otherwise. Switzerland being probably an outlier in that, because Switzerland has remained one of the more economically free and civically minded free. But on the other hand, something about Switzerland which is interesting, it's, moving from canton to canton is not an easy thing, in the same way that moving from Washington, D.C. to Tennessee because of a job opportunity. It's easier than the United States. It's a little harder in Switzerland.
Well, it's a pure federalist system over there, right? There's a lot of local autonomy.
System. Exactly. But in the case of Germany, and Germany has, of course, gone through major changes, not just, pre and post World War II, but the biggest change was the collapse of the Soviet Union and the sudden realization of Eastern Germans realizing, I can go to Berlin, I can go to Frankfurt, I can try for that job at the BMW plant in Munich, and I couldn't have done that before. And now, what does that mean? But then, because they have lived in a place where the state took care of things, their expectations were, of course, the state in the West would take care of them as well. And that's the fomenting problem that you have in Europe today.
We seem to be heading into a period of instability in Europe, economic stagnation. We've got new parties rising on the right, which are somewhat frightening, using language from the earlier fascists. Take us back a little bit to the Hong Kong story that we discussed earlier. They're going through some turmoil right now, seeking those political liberties. If they get them, if democracy comes to Hong Kong, would you predict that they can maintain their economic freedoms, or they'll become more like Europe?
Well, I think Louis might have made the question that we've all become rich now. And what does that mean? And I think at the end of the day, money does talk. The problem is who has what money. And I think the bigger challenge, and a reason why China is sort of wanting to hold Hong Kong more tightly, is that there's a lot of money flowing back into the coffers of the political elite in Beijing. Unfortunately, that's a system that China has had. That's the truth about a communist system, is it's basically the powerful elite who are the wealthiest, because they're essentially stealing money.
Let's pause on that for a moment, because that's what Alexander Hamilton considered the lubricant of democracy. He actually tolerated a certain amount of corruption and a certain amount of the elites putting their, and sort of, he was involved in that. If you look at the manipulation of the Revolutionary War debt, where he and his friends enriched themselves, he thought that was an important stability factor.
Yes, and I think this is getting back to the age-old question, would you rather live in a stable society where you seem to have what you, quote-unquote, need, or would you rather live in a place where it's unclear what tomorrow may bring, but you feel that you have a bit more say in what tomorrow may bring? that's a question that's not just about the history of the United States, but it goes back to our own communities, even our own family. We don't like risk, and some do. And the degree to which you tolerate that is the degree to which you also have your government support you in that. And I think Alexander Hamilton was also realizing, for example, this is the early stage of a new country. So therefore, what corners am I going to cut? What principles am I going to bend a bit in order to provide stability over the next couple hundred years? He's not the first politician to think that way or act that way.
Lawson, at CEI, you're very focused on addressing excesses of the regulatory state that have tipped the balance away from risk and toward security. This is always a dynamic tension in any society. How do you see it today?
I think we're dealing with a situation in the United States where the increase in what you might call the regulated state has been growing exponentially in the last 25, 30 years. The problem with, I think, public policy debates is that we tend to focus on the scope of federal spending and deficits. And those certainly can be sobering conversations to have. But the problem with regulation in general, and this can be economic regulation, it can be social regulation, it can be defined in a variety of ways, is that all works in the shadows.
Doesn't show up on the balance sheet.
It's not the balance sheet. And that has been an explicit move by Congress, for example, the last 25 years to shift what they saw as a burden that the executive branch should handle. And what has now happened is there's zero oversight when it comes to the regulatory process. And so when we talk about government burden, we tend to not really realize how big it is because of the growth of the regulatory state. So at CEI and other organizations, we look at regulations as fundamentally a hidden tax. Regulating something does not mean it shouldn't be.
Of course.
There's nothing inherently wrong with the concept of regulation. I think we would all want that for our 16-year-old drivers as they're heading to the intersection where the traffic lights. We would like that to be a highly regulated intersection. So there's no problem with that. It has really more to do with our ability to explore and to dream and to experiment and to try, and the impact of not being able to do that on our lives. And we don't understand that. And so trying to quantify that, of course, is one of the biggest challenges of all.
Right. If you can't measure it, you can't manage it.
It's interesting. There was a fascinating study that came out just a couple of weeks ago by a woman named, I think it was Deborah Borey-Holtz, and I don't know her. And she did this survey of business owners in 5 Midwestern states. And they found, interestingly enough, that these business owners indeed felt overwhelmed by the sheer number of regulations. And in most cases, more than 80% couldn't name a specific regulation that burdened them. And that, I think, is the challenge. So you hear this phrase of overregulated, but what does it actually
It's death by 1,000
mean?
cuts.
Death by 1,000 cuts. Certainly we need to pay more attention to the effect of regulatory volume on sort of the political rhetoric surrounding regulation. That's important. But what's the causality with it, too? Republicans tend to be, quote unquote, anti-regulation. Democrats tend to be for regulation. Those are stereotypes, I think, to a certain extent. And maybe, as we were talking earlier, maybe it has to do with the view that the traditional liberal aspect of society wants to use the state to control our behavior, and the other does not. Now, that may or may not be true. People need to understand from when they wake up in the morning to when they actually go to bed at night, literally their lives are affected by regulation.
Sure.
And without saying that those are wrong. So
some in good ways and some in bad ways.
Yes, yeah. When your radio goes off, it's the FCC airways that are, that are telling you what to do. Your head is on a pillow that essentially has controls over how fire retardant it can or can't be. And again, I would like to know that my clothes are not going to burn me the night that is imaginary bias. So there's no issue with that. But then you move on to the eggs that you try to cook and how
big the cages are for the chickens, right?
Exactly. You haven't even got to the car yet. Your children are still struggling with a toothbrush. No, now toothbrush and toothpaste. There's going to be a little bit of what you can and can't put in those things. And I think trying to get a sense of, wait a minute, we live in this world where some government entity somewhere has decided what you can and can't do with that. Now, again, that may be the correct decision, but it's being aware that that is happening. That's, I think, where this conversation about the loss of economic and civil liberty and whatnot comes to play.
Let's get back to my original question, which is, what are the checks and balances that keep political liberty, which gives you control over the state, economic liberty, which creates growth and prosperity, and civil liberty, which gives us a society worth living in. How do we manage the checks and balances between those three?
We talked about Alexander Hamilton earlier. Smartest decision the founders ever made was the notion of transparency and of competing with one another politically. And what I mean by that is the entire existence of the United States, our Constitution, our Bill of Rights, the Declaration of Independence, exists really on the premise of a certain distrust of our fellow man. Now, that sounds a little harsh at front, but what I mean by that is it's protecting us from each other, but more importantly, it's protecting us from what the state does, because the state is made up of us as well. And I think that certain competitive distrust is what is a brilliant move in our government today. And to your question of how do we actually limit it, we have to be more transparent in understanding that. So in the case of regulations, first rule of all is nothing ever ends. When a regulation goes into effect, it stays on the books forever. It's the gift that keeps on giving.
Even when the circumstances change, the technology changes, the market changes.
In fact, today, government simply can't keep up with technology. But the problem is they're so focused on trying to that they neglect the thousands and thousands of rules still on the book. So one thing that has been proposed and thought of in D.C., you may or may not remember years ago in the 90s, there was a Base Realignment and Closure Commission. This was the problem of post-Cold War, numerous military bases everywhere, and the military being very wise and putting a base in almost each congressional district.
Right, to get the votes, but they didn't need them anymore.
Of course, and now you have to close them. So how do you take the politics out of that? And the BRAC Commission was established. The rules were that Congress had to vote up or down.
Up or down.
It's either yes or no. The same has been trying now with regulations, and this would be how we deal with regulations already on the books.
That'd become obsolete or counterproductive.
Exactly. Or where you really cannot quantify what the benefit is. And so Congress would every year get a list. Here are these 1,000, up or down, take it out. You also avoid some of the challenges of the private sector using the regulatory process in a cronyist way. And that's one way. It's just a small way of actually getting things off the book. And of course, I'm only talking the federal level. This is replicated at the state and the local level as well, which is, I think, where the challenge is here. So that's just one example. A second example from a purely legislative standpoint would be pass something that any regulation that has an economic impact of $100 million or more has to be an up or down vote by Congress. For example, there are 52 pending rules right now in this White House that have an impact of $100 million or more. But Congress doesn't have any vote on those because they've already approved a law, and it's the writing of it that now has the impact. So, Bill, you can say this rule will cost this much, but that doesn't mean Congress can or can't do anything about it.
Lawson, there's an election coming up, and there are widespread predictions we're going to see a change in government. There may be a Republican Congress and a Republican Senate. Is there any reason to believe that when they get control, they're going to rule any differently than Democrats?
Well, in name, yes. I've been in Washington long enough to know that, you can put faith in one party to do something, but once they actually are in power, reality sometimes sets in. And I think this is because you've got individuals and you've got a lot of ego, and it's the typical Washington problem. That being said, stereotypically, given what has been going on in the House recent years, especially on this sort of beginning conversation about overregulation, having a change in leadership in the Senate, which is where most things have stalled the last 4 years, provides an opportunity, at least an opportunity for Congress to play a greater role in a bicameral way on oversight of some of these issues in the executive branch. Where I have a little bit of doubt, or where I think the Republicans can maybe make up some ground, is they bear a lot of the responsibility, I think, for this shift from Congress to the executive branch.
Outsourcing, right.
Exactly, and that's outsourcing is precisely what happened. So a good example, when they swept into power in 1994, we all remember that was the first time in a very long time when people all of a sudden find themselves in power, the power of personal politics comes into play. And one of the things the new majority did was they cut budgeting for congressional investigations of executive branch agencies. Now, it was done partially for the noble spirit of cost cutting. That's great. Truth of the matter is, it was really done as a punitive measure against some of the very influential members of Congress, such as John Dingell, who pretty much could haul anybody from the White House
Right.
up before them, and they were sort of had a little payback. The problem with that is, a penny spent on oversight can probably save $1 in unnecessary regulatory costs. And the Republicans now are in a position to say, okay, time to maybe replace some staff, actually haul up agencies before, because there really was a time back in even the 70s and in the early 80s when Democrats and Republicans would investigate the executive branch to protect their constitutional role as lawmakers.
Those are days long gone by.
Those are days long gone. I mean, there was almost this bipartisan agreement to sort of protect Congress
Right, their
as
privileges.
an institution from executive. Right, exactly. And that has, the individual partisanship has increased where it's now about sticking with your president, your party, rather than the constitutional authority.
But hasn't Congress figured out by outsourcing all the power that they are supposed to wield to the executive branch, they don't get stuck with the blame?
I think polling numbers will show that Congress gets stuck with the blame.
Anyway, okay.
I think it's pretty fair to say that their popularity
below
is
used car dealers,
not terribly high right now. So at this point, there's really not much they can do to make it worse. So they might as well actually look like they're trying to accomplish something, again, on the sort of regulatory side, which I think we have a lot more of the sort of general public supportive, because if you change the regulatory structure, again, you go back to changing how private industry uses the regulatory process in a very anti-competitive way.
I suppose if they did it by staying out of the most contentious areas and at least start in the least contentious areas, do we really need mohair regulations? We look at some of the barnacles that have collected. That might be a better place to start than going after, global warming on day one.
Yeah, probably. If you remember back in 1984, do you remember the highest grossing movie that was in 1984?
No.
It's Ghostbusters.
Ah.
Now, besides the wonderful plot, who was the bad guy?
Oh, that's right. It
wasn't the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man.
Right.
It was Walter Peck, and Walter Peck was an EPA agent who was, needlessly meddling and destroying New York. So if you think about it, the villain in the highest grossing movie in 1984 was a federal agency. And let's be honest, movie makers don't risk alienating moviegoers.
Right.
So what was it that moviegoers were receptive to about accepting the fact that an agency, the EPA, was sort of the bad guy?
I never thought about that.
You got to go back and look at the late 1970s and the fact that the EPA was being seen as the quintessential overbearing agency. Very heavy-handed. All the gas ration, all those things that we knew were going on, and it had this backlash. As a result, we got Walter Peck, but more importantly, that was also part of the re-election, or the election, I should say, of Ronald Reagan, who certainly was not the most perfect deregulatory president.
Not at all.
But, in fairness to him and Jimmy Carter, he actually continued some of the things that Jimmy Carter actually had started. Trucking, railroad, airlines.
Fair enough. Lawson, people have been very concerned about the infringement of economic liberties by an all-powerful state, but we're beginning to see very strange infringement of civil liberties, and I'd like to ask you about a few cases. One is the militarization of local police. The second is eminent domain abuse, where we're seeing regulatory agencies steal property from individuals to hand to favored cronies to do things like build hotels and casinos. And then, of course, there's civil forfeiture, where we've got police stealing cash from motorists who are driving by under laws that were originally put in place to try to chase drug dealers. Is there a pattern here?
It's an interesting shift, I think, in how we view that world of regulation. It's fair to say that you can have strong disagreement over how, for example, environmental regulation should be put into bear. That's fine. Because I think people's motivations is, you don't want to put it in the question, but fine. We like clean air. We like clean water. So fine. We'll have a robust debate. It's more about the how you do it, not necessarily the why you're doing it. So let's set that aside. But as you start to see the state move into the domain of protecting the larger industry against its own citizens, you start to see political dynamics shift. And that, I think, is where within the conservative movement, you're seeing the fracture with libertarians and conservatives over this issue, because conservatives are seen as wanting to protect the state, to use the
police
rule
power,
of law.
right.
And at the same time, it's coming at a pretty high cost. What it now looks like is that they're losing control. And I think the eminent domain issue is a great one, because I, in a sense, suspect if you surveyed 100 people, 80 would say, well, if we need to build a highway or we need to put a school in, okay, as long as the owner is paid a reasonable
But that's
fee,
never been
fine.
that contentious.
No, but the contentious one is when Walmart comes in and says, I'm going to use the power of the state to take that property for my own purposes. Now you're getting a different kind of reaction.
Mm-hmm.
And that's been contentious. You have the fact that the police presence has moved into really a military presence, and the perception of that. And then they try to claim, well, the way you avoid being shot is don't touch us. Like, that's really not a great argument to be made. And gone are the days of the police as a community presence.
That was a huge trend, wasn't it? Back in actually starting in the 80s, community policing became a huge trend. People were in touch and on the beat and talking to the folks that were trying to protect. What happened to that?
Gone. Gone. And even, you remember all the bailouts that we had years ago? Some of the states took that money and they were going to hire more police. Well, they hired more police, but they also hired police who, looked like they were about to go invade Iraq. And I think that just symbolizes the concern we have of that growing power of the state. The fact that you said the passing motorist gets pulled over, next thing you know, he's lost all of his watches and things. And then the police chief comes out and says, well, we have to, pay for it somehow. This is really fomenting, I think, at the state level. And I think the conservatives are probably more at risk with letting this go because they're seen as this rule of law party. And there's a backlash that's there. It's particularly troubling, particularly dangerous. I think for governors, it's going to become one of their biggest issues is how you are seen in terms of your relationship with the state police and the local police. And if you do not manage that effectively, I don't think it matters what you do with tax policy.
Lawson, many people say America is in decline. Is that true?
I think people are going to say America's in decline since probably Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson had an argument over something. So, do I think we're in decline? I think the American spirit is never in decline because I think at the end of the day, it's about opportunity and it's about hope, and those are things that are really important. I went to Berlin this last summer. It was my first time there since before the wall came down. I used to spend a lot of time back in the day in East Berlin and East Germany. And I took my children, and I will never forget taking a bike ride. And we're zipping along, and they're having a grand day and a grand evening, and we come up to the main Berliner Tor, Brandenburger Gate, which is everybody knows that. And my kids go zipping right through it
without a thought.
Literally, I had to stop. I had to put my hand on the side, and I literally wept because they had no idea that 30 years ago they would have died if they tried to do that.
They would have gunned you down.
And how joyful it is that they don't know what that is. And to me, that's, I think, part of the hope. Those are sobering experiences 30 years ago. But now they're soaking up the sunset. They're in a populated plaza. They're seeing everybody milling around. And to me, that's the hope and the greater promise. And no, I don't think we're in decline because I think that indigenous spirit that we had a part of is what is promulgating.
Lawson, on that note, thanks for being on the show.
Thanks, Bill. Happy to do it.
That was Lawson Bader, president of the Competitive Enterprise Institute, our sponsor, here on Real Clear Radio Hour. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. If you have any suggestions for topics or guests, please visit realclearradio.org, click on the email Bill link, and drop me a line. Real Clear Radio Hour is produced in conjunction with Real Clear Politics, America's premier independent political website. This coming week, my campus lecture tour hosted by the Young Americans for Liberty visits Georgetown University and Virginia Tech. Please stop by www.yaliberty.org for more information. That wraps up our show for this week. Join us next week, same time, same station. See you then.